Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 41 of the Embodied Business Inspired Brain podcast. I am always just so thrilled to be recording these episodes. I love being with Anne. I think we enjoy co-regulating and spending time together and geeking out. We had actually a pretty, like a 20-minute conversation before we started recording. And sometimes we do this and then we realize we should have been recording all the time. So I think today we're gonna be kind of hashing out what we think about this particular topic in a way, and we want to bring some real life examples to the surface. So for those of you who are curious about how to leverage the nervous system and nervous system awareness in your either high performing work lives and environments or your complex personal lives, this is really what we're talking about today, is leveraging the nervous system and nervous system awareness in times of challenge and difficulty, whether that's times of change, of growth, scaling, transition. Personal transitions can be, I think we talked in our last episode, episode 40, we talked about egoic death and the transition from one identity to the other. We're going to kind of open up that conversation a little bit more because of the work we've been doing with more founders and organizations who are really doing the work of scaling and they are experiencing big change. We've been kind of swimming in this a little bit more. And so we wanted to bring that to the surface for you. It's the middle of July. We're halfway through the summer. And we're launching next week, Monday, this really beautiful 5-day nervous system reset called Midsummer Pause and Savor, which I am so excited about. I mean, I just feel like we really nailed the topic on this one. So Midsummer Savor, Pause and Savor. How are you feeling about that, Anne?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I definitely feel like ever since we've come up with the title and thinking about how we want to support our community with it, there's been moments that I've had, even with my own family in particular, where I've been, I'm going to do that. I'm going to be even more intentional about pausing and savoring. And I would say, it's not always like the pause and savor isn't always beautiful or a moment, but I was just really pausing. Like, here's an example. This morning, I was pausing in the moment with one of my children, and they were, resisting going to camp. I didn't want to go to camp. And I just was really listening to the sound that they were making, which was a lot of auditory sounds. And it was sort of like crying, but not really. It was just like, and I was like, wow, there it is. There's the self-regulation. And I didn't say anything, but I think like I didn't say like, oh, keep going, keep making that noise. Like that's the last thing they want to hear me say. I think they don't want me to
offer commentary.
Yeah, but I think for me as a parent, like knowing like, oh, they're making that noise because, they're not making a high pitched scream. They're making a noise that's really, getting their vocal cords to vibrate because that's something that ultimately is regulating. And what I've loved so much about this work is just seeing my children just do things.
Yeah.
Like, oh, and I used to do that, or I still do that. And it's just a lot of permission. And I think for me as the parent, it makes me feel more safe about their behavior or what they're doing because they're just doing it. And, most kids, I think, will do these things to regulate themselves. So I'm sort of wrapping this into a what's in progress.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
So I would say that for me this week, just seeing that, just it naturally enveloping and just And me, again, as a parent, just noticing it and just like letting it unfold and not thinking anything weird. And then what was really interesting is I just stayed with it. I paused with it. I was just in it. And it wasn't some like beautiful moment where we were looking at the sunset. It was like a pause where like they were really self regulating and irritated. But, I was just able to pause with it. And then, a few minutes later, it had worked itself out. Like,
Yeah.
there wasn't a lot of excitement about going to the camp, but there was not a total digging in of the heels
Yeah.
and we will never go, right? Like, there was an acceptance, I think. So that was just a beautiful moment. And it happened this morning.
Yeah. I really appreciate this because I think, we often talk about, expanding our capacity and how this work helps us to expand our capacity, not just to come to neutral. And I appreciate the perspective of you just pausing and savoring whatever moment that you're in, even if it's very mundane and slightly challenging, and how the pausing, and we talk about this in our facilitation work, is like the pause is the number one piece, right? It's the moment where you get to like look around and wake up to what's happening and check in with yourself. And that in and of itself is regulating for you. And then to just have this appreciation, and this is really what we're talking about today, is like, because you have this knowledge, because you've been in this practice, you can see what's happening with your child through a very different lens, and you can have more, not just compassion, but understanding and curiosity. And even maybe like, I have definitely found myself like kind of chuckling when my daughter, gets very worked up, and I'm like, I can lean into my awareness of like, well, what's happening in her 10-year-old brain, and how is her nervous system expressing itself right now? And I can just kind of chuckle because I'm like, oh yeah, it's all just happening. And it's not like she's choosing to be a little turkey. Like, she just is. And it is a savoring moment. And I've been thinking about this a lot because, and I think we talked about it in the last podcast episode. So it's clearly a big deal for me right now. But, my son being 18 and then my daughter still being at home at 10, I'm in this interesting place of like, I think a beautiful place where I actually feel kind of like sadness about my 18-year-old not being a 10-year-old anymore. And I keep like wanting to I keep taking myself back, to all these moments of not only fun and joy, but also the hard times. And it's like, I want that again. I want to like hold on to that and relive all of those moments again, which is like making me really intentional about the way I am with my daughter, particularly when she's difficult, because, she's self-proclaimed preteen, and it's not always easy. So I just really appreciate that. And the idea of pausing and savoring, I mean, obviously, since we're running this program next week, I have been thinking a lot about the relationship between regulation and dysregulation and our ability to savor, and I think another way to say that is just like our ability to be present. But the product of presence to me is the ability to savor. So it's more than just presence, right? It's like the consequence of presence is savoring in a lot of ways. So I've just been like chewing on that a whole lot, both from like, how do I do that better? And what has prevented me from doing that in the past. So
Mhm.
yeah, I'm excited about that.
I would just say, like, to push the conversation further, it's like, had I not savored with him, or maybe if you do not savor or pause with your daughter, and you sort of just push through because, hey, you and I can push, like, we're familiar with that. Probably many of you who listen to this podcast are familiar with, like, you just do the thing and you just move forward. The problem is then there's a lot of dysregulation within your family.
Yeah.
And the reality that that's not going to affect your work or your productivity, or that you somehow, put up some wall. I'm really, leaning into this, it's BS that there is this, straight dichotomy between your work life and your personal life. I mean, maybe that could happen with, 1950s men where they had a very
Yeah.
like divided life. And sure, I mean, if I had a cook and a maid and a lover, I just was like there for, with me right when I came home, but like that's not the reality, right? And so for me, I just think it's important to realize like your ability to regulate with those or just be present for someone who is dysregulating, whether that's someone in your family or potentially in your work life.
Yeah.
That, it's just, it improves all of your functioning.
Mhm.
And that's definitely one of the strengths of the awareness piece of the nervous system work.
Yeah. Well, if we just dive into the topic for today, if we
Mhm.
just take this, let's just take this scenario and transmute it into a business or work situation. And I mean, I think we've talked about kind of like how does the work impact you? Let's just say you, the listener, are either you practice nervous system work or you're like, I'm going to choose to add this to my toolbox. Like what Anne is saying, when you become dysregulated by somebody else's dysregulation and you are the leader, you are coloring the whole environment negatively, right? You are stressing the whole environment. Like it doesn't stop with the person who's originally dysregulated, right? It's like now your dysregulation impacts the way you lead, the way you make choices, the way you communicate. And so there is this ripple effect that we're often not aware of, which is why the awareness is so important, so that we can take a moment, back up, change directions, figure out how to regulate ourselves before we enter into more conversations, before we change the strategy, before we react, right? Because otherwise we're just continuing the dysregulation, basically like passing it on from one person to the other. So, yeah, it happens in all kinds of systems, not just the family system, but the systems within organizations. We were talking about we were talking about how this work, okay, so if you take it outside of yourself, if you are interested in obtaining another layer or level of skill in the way that you coach or consult or lead people through difficulty, particularly, then what we've been noticing or what we've been working with is you don't actually have to share nervous system work explicitly with others. Let's just say you are a consultant and you're working with an organization that's in major transition, and you have two of your primary leaders, and one is super jazzed. They are showing up, they are communicative, they are coming up with creative solutions, they're pushing the process forward. They very clearly are at ease in the change and transition. You probably getting a lot of communication back and forth. They're responsive, they're flexible, they're malleable, they're open to feedback. But then the other leader is severely dysregulated, right? In a defense mode. So the nervous system, they don't feel safe in the change and the transition. There's the loss of something, going back to episode 40, we're talking about that egoic death. If it's very strong in a person, they're going to have a response, right? And so let's just say leader two is combative. They're often not completing tasks. They're not communicating. So we think about this fight or flight, right, as being retreating or rebelling. So that combative energy, that agitation, that questioning, the defensiveness. So you have these two people, and let's talk about leader two. And let's just say you have exhausted all of the skills that you have to support this person, and they're still not on board. They're still not participating. Or if they're participating, they're self sabotaging. This is something we kind of see a lot. And so, what we were kind of entering with in our earlier discussion was you don't have to even necessarily make this leader too aware of their nervous system, or you don't have to teach them nervous system work outrightly. I mean, you certainly can, and we support people in doing that, but not all domains are right for that, right? Not all people are open to that. And so what we are discovering and what we are supporting folks with is how much power you have as the guiding consultant, right? You're supporting the leader to be able to one, and this Anne will jump in here because we had this interesting little conversation earlier. It can be in these high performance and stressful environments difficult to have compassion for a person who is behaving badly, right? And maybe you have compassion, but it can be difficult to then take that and put it into action when you're dealing with. So now we're still talking about leader two, right? Let's say Anne and I are the consultants and we're working with leader two. And if you don't understand that their behavior is being driven by their nervous system and that it's because they don't feel safe, and that lack of safety, that dysregulation impacts the way their brain works. If you don't have that information, it's almost like you have to put way more effort into supporting this difficult leader, right? And you might get stuck. You might run out of tools. You might run out of strategies, right? You might not have, because when somebody is very dysregulated, man, they can just grind it out, right? It's so hard to unlock people from that place unless you have this awareness of like, oh, this person is not just being difficult. They're not just an a-hole. They're not just, purposely sabotaging, but there's something below the surface that's going on that is preventing them from understanding the strategy we're trying to, move them through. Or there's something that's stopping them from communicating well with us, right? And it's not just that they're bad communicators or they're lacking in intelligence. They're not, but there's something else going on. And when we have that understanding, we can change the strategy in very creative ways to soothe the nervous system and optimize the brain, or bring the brain in what we call as a toward state, right? A state where there is a sense of safety, and literally physiologically we see more, hear more, express better, can do all of these things that we cannot do, literally physically cannot do when we're in a dysregulated state. So that was really that's a very long-winded way of that was the jumping off point. I would be interested, Anne, for us to go back to the compassion piece and for you to share the thing about compassion that you shared with me earlier.
Absolutely. So I think, for better or worse, I've just always been the type of person where I do just have a lot of compassion for other people, even prior to understanding the nervous system work. Another way to say it is I seem to have a greater tolerance of misbehavior, whether that's compassion led, whether that's just a higher tolerance led, and that would be an interesting thing to pick apart, but we haven't yet picked that one apart. um, so what I found for me personally was the nervous system work, because I already had a high level of compassion for people who were misbehaving.
I love that framing. For bad behavior, is that what you said? I have a higher tolerance for bad behavior.
Yeah, it's like, because I go and always had the story. Well, there's something going on in them that I don't know, and so I'll let it slide. Or what can I do that can support them in starting to behave better?
Mhm.
But then I do find that I did lack a lot of self compassion. And so for me, as someone who loves biology and someone who appreciates understanding physiology and the way the body works, understanding the nervous system work allowed me to have a lot more self compassion if I was misbehaving, if I was not acting well, or finding myself in a state of dysregulation. And dysregulation could be, you know, anxiety, stress, overwhelm, just not operating and it can get, if we're talking about trauma, it can, really go far down the pike. But Chantel and I are more just speaking within, the container of, average sort of normal life experience
Mhm.
versus something like a trauma or
Yeah.
something like that. And so for me, it was very helpful. And I think when I had greater compassion for myself, it allowed me to then speak, to set better boundaries and actually reduce my tolerance and misbehavior of others, which I think was a good teeter-totter effect for the nervous system work. And I say that because Chantel thinks that there's not a lot of people like me. So,
Well,
and I'm like,
that are truly just able to readily tap into a lot of compassion for others. I don't. I mean, I really I really have to like, but my compassion for others has grown and grown. I feel like I have often had compassion for myself. That's been an easier piece. So we're opposite. So
yes,
help.
so interesting.
Yeah. And I think I don't want to go down this rabbit hole very far, but I want to stick my toe in it because I think it's relevant because of what you said, which is I do think a lot of people mistake appeasement, and it is, in my experience, not always genuine compassion, but it is this quality of appeasing or retracting from what's unsafe, which can be mistaken as compassion. And I think I'm saying this now because of what you said, which is when you started having more compassion for yourself, that your tolerance for bad behavior went down. That to me says you feel safer in yourself, and therefore you're able to stay more steady in your regulation. We say anchored into that ventral state, so that you are not just going to appease and ignore bad behavior, right? Like your ability to be with difficult conversations. This is something we've talked about a lot, and we have been in discussion a lot with each other about sharing feedback with each other and having difficult conversations. Definitely, I notice your ability or your willingness to tolerate bad behavior from me has gone down, which is so good. But I think so am I being clear? Like, I see you as a very compassionate person. And there is this piece that's like, oh, that's not actually compassion. That's dysregulation. That's a defense strategy. And I think this is more of what happens than that natural tapping into compassion.
Mm.
I think it is more of what I have seen in adults than this ability to just be naturally, readily compassionate. I often see it as a defense mechanism to avoid what's unsafe. So that could be an entire episode, but I just wanted to, you know, I just like stick my toe in that just a little bit. So Yeah, I don't think it's very easy for most adults, particularly in high performance situations, to really have genuine compassion. But I want you to say more about when you have been able to, now that you're able to have more compassion for yourself, how has that influenced? Well, I think I have two questions for you, which is how is becoming aware of your nervous system helped with more self compassion? If you could say like more about that. And then my second question is, with that greater self compassion, how has that changed the way you work with your clients or your team or your staff? I'm thinking back, also about, when you were navigating a big team of teachers with the studio.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way I found it create more compassion for myself is just being clear about what you're willing to tolerate, right? So if I was leading my team or something, I could be more aware of like, well, that behavior is not tolerable.
You mean like because you're having more compassion for yourself, you're able to say, no, that behavior out there or that stimulus or whatever's going out there is actually not good for me. And so I'm going to honor that as the priority and be able to say whatever you need to say or take whatever action you're.
Yeah.
So I think it's important for people to understand a little bit more specifically the link between the nervous system awareness, and how does that lead to self-compassion. So can you share a little bit of that for you, and like what was it about becoming aware of your nervous system that led to more self-compassion?
Yeah, absolutely. Because one of the things that I think I have always found interesting, but then not that interested in was there's so much about self compassion, right? There's a
Yep.
lot about compassion out there in different types of mindfulness techniques,
Right.
but those ways of trying to get to self compassion just completely fell flat for me. Like I didn't
Too woo woo or
feel,
self-helpy or.
yeah, or just like, okay, I'm supposed to meditate or say a mantra about it or whatever, but like it didn't, I intellectually understood it, but I didn't have a felt sense.
Yeah.
And so for me, the, I think the compassion piece with the nervous system work really connected because I'm someone who appreciates biology, who likes the concept of biology. And when I say that, when I understood that if I'm dysregulated, I am just my body is just having a response. So an example I think would be if I'm already dysregulated and I have this lens of dysregulation, I might experience other things in my life as dangerous or not pleasant,
Yeah.
even when really they're neutral
Yeah.
or they're pleasant, right? And so having that understanding that it's my biology, I'm like at a heightened level. And I would also add my understanding of pain science and understanding that our nervous systems can become primed or slanted or have some sort of a tint of danger or non-danger and how that colors how you view everything
Yeah.
allowed me to say, oh, things really aren't as bad as I'm thinking they are.
Mm,
I because my biology is causing me to see it this way.
yeah.
And I think that allowed me to have the self-compassion. But, clearly there's different people, right? And so some people might find a mindfulness, self-compassion to meditation to be the ticket for them.
Sure.
For me, it never was.
Yeah.
And so for me, having that compassion piece was just and understanding the nervous system behind it is the thing that allowed me to really start to step into self-compassion, which has been lovely to have in business and in personal relationships.
Yeah, and to expand it, right? To like the more you practice and the more you are aware of this, response system, the more compassion you can have for yourself and then for others, right? So when we're talking about dealing with challenge and high performance environments, I think particularly if you've been called in as a consultant or somebody to support the change, there's a heavy weight and burden of fulfillment and success, and it is such a difficult environment, right? It is a highly charged environment with lots of people being dysregulated for lots of reasons and for reasons that are not accurate, to your point, right? When we are dysregulated, we often see things that what we call cues of safety or cues of danger. We will often see things that are cues of safety and misinterpret them as dangerous, or be a cue of safety, something that is further dysregulating. So if you're the responsible party to come in to lead the change, having self-compassion for the fact that you are probably under duress and you are under duress and reacting to all of these people you are there to lead, who are in the midst of this change and transition, all responding differently, all responding accurately or inaccurately. Like having that self compassion for yourself, I wonder if you agree with this, allows you to like recover more quickly and stay present and stay in that creative problem solving place. Like rather than spinning out and feeling stuck yourself and not being able to communicate well with, the players in this organization. And I'm thinking about like in our own business, when we've come up against something challenging, we always do better when we can co-regulate, when we can recover quickly, and we can go back to the drawing board without like carrying the baggage and the weight of the whatever was dysregulating. It's like we can cleanse, we can like start over more quickly. Do you feel like that is an accurate description in terms of something that self-compassion supports?
Absolutely. And I think an example is something you used to say a lot a couple of years ago where it really struck me because I think a lot of people who are in these high performance situations of consulting, et cetera, are very smart. And they're very smart because they use their brains a lot
Yeah.
and they can think their way through lots of problems
Yes.
and find solutions through cognitive load and thinking. But as you have said for many years now, there are some things you cannot think your way through.
100%.
I think most people who are really smart can say, I get something intellectually, like I intellectually get this thing, yet I don't feel it. Right. And so I think,
Therefore, I can't leverage it if I don't really deeply understand it.
right. And I think sometimes people will say the answer is, well, just trust and just do it anyways. But sometimes if you're really lacking a felt sense of safety, an embodied sense of safety, even if you try to fake execute it,
Yeah.
you really can't fake execute it that well.
Yeah. Well, because
Like,
you're making it on top of a dysregulated system. It's like,
right. And because I feel like that's what I've heard a lot is like, well, just trust the process or,
yeah.
like, and it's like, well, but my body is completely saying something is not safe or I can't trust the process.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think the nervous system, that awareness and being able to have these types of nuanced conversations
Mhm.
about feelings, about what happens in work, about what happens in your personal life, allows you as someone to really to have more self-compassion with yourself and then also with your clients as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just to close the conversation and bring it full circle, I feel incredibly compelled by this idea that with the awareness as the leader of the change and transition, I can bring a whole different capacity to supporting the people who are players in the change and transition. So it's not just about my own self compassion, but I can actually behave differently. I can assess differently. I can create strategy and implement and integrate differently because I'm seeing the players through this other lens, which is physiologically, we're all just responding unconsciously and very differently. And so it's like that to me is such a hugely valuable like lens to be able to see through that just makes me feel more confident in my ability to work through difficult, situations, especially with, in high performance environments. So I think we have probably a lot more to say about this, but we do also like to keep our podcast short. So we honor your time and your attention, and that's available. And I'm sure we'll dig back into this at another time. But thanks as always, Anne, for the conversation. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Chantal.